Good evening. Welcome to St. Catherine University. My name is Nicole Watson, and I am the director of the Catherine G. Murphy Gallery. On behalf of the gallery and the Art and Art History Department here at St. Kate's, I am delighted to welcome Chicago-based artist Caroline Kent, who is this year's Amy Marie Sears Visiting Artist. This is an annual series that invites a distinguished artist to St. Catherine University for a week-long residency. This series was established in honor of Amy Marie Sears, a promising 1995 studio art major who passed away in 1997. Caroline's exhibition, Beyond the Carmen Line, is currently on view in the West Gallery. Her residency, titled Improvisational Maneuvers in the Dark, includes tonight's public lecture, as well as student workshops Caroline is hosting throughout the week. In these workshops, Caroline is utilizing the gallery space and her exhibition to guide students in exploring improvisation, performance, movement, and shape invention to provide a framework of alternative, experiential context for her work. Before I turn the podium over to Caroline, I'd like to tell you a little bit about her and her practice. Caroline explores the relationship between painting, language, and translation, and she is invested in finding new ways to subvert and complicate normative reading and writing structures through painting. Kent received her MFA from the University of Minnesota in 2008. She is a recipient of the 2016 McKnight Fellowship for Visual Arts, a 2015 Pollock Krasner Foundation grant, and a 2009 Jerome Fellowship in Fine Art. Her recent solo exhibitions include Disappearance of the Word, Appearance of the World at the Union for Contemporary Art in Omaha, Nebraska, and Joyful is the Dark at Public Functionary in Minneapolis. From a personal perspective, I can tell you she is one of the most collegial and energetic painters I have ever worked with. Please join me in welcoming tonight's lecturer, Caroline Kent.
Perfect. Okay. And do I advance just going like that? Oh, with that. Oh,
Either click
okay.
or you can press.
Cool. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here tonight. I want to say a thank you to all these amazing women in this department that have been so helpful with this residency, to Anne, Carol, Kim, and Nicole. Thank you so much. And there are more of you, I'm certain, behind the scenes. So thank you. This has been an exciting day. It started off the residency, and I'm really looking forward to kind of walk you through my practice. My ambition tonight is to be clear as possible and to kind of show you one of the major facets of my practice. It's broader than just what you'll see tonight, but I'm focusing on the abstract paintings that I make. So I thought I would start off with this title because it's kind of a nod to cinema and film titles, and I thought it was a good way to start talking about how I got interested in making art in the first place, and that comes through probably how I was viewing the world. I think most artists can kind of pinpoint a moment or a time when they really felt like, okay, this is when I've decided to be an artist. And I think that for me, that was maybe when I was around 20, which feels like really late in the game in some ways. I feel like some people like knew when they were drawing at 3 years old. But for me, I grew up in a small town in Sterling, Illinois, and I think for me, film and watching television and other kinds of media were my way out, exploring the world. And so I watched, in my teenage years up into my early 20s, I watched a lot of foreign language films. So it's really those films that started piquing my interest to the world outside of this small town. But at the same time, there were certain things about those films and how they functioned when I was reading subtitles and when I was looking at a moving image, and when that image would pause, and considering the relationship of text and written language in relationship to an audio language, an audible sound, kind of figuring out how does that text relate to the whole image, and some different film tropes that I became used to. So that had a large influence on me. And when I went to grad school and started thinking about abstract painting, what fascinated me was, watching all these language films, I started thinking about my fascination with other languages became apparent. And I was not only curious about these other places, but I was fascinated that all these languages come from a specific place in the world or geography, or these languages have shifted and changed over time and space, and they seem to move around and they seem to be attached to place. And I thought, watching all these films, it was interesting to me that I always felt kind of on the outside, having to read text. I'm the viewer on the outside of language, but there are people that actually are on the inside. And that relationship was a question, and I think that kind of question was there before I knew how to form it. And so these ideas of language, translation, abstraction are kind of the three things that I kind of go back to in my practice. I'm always asking questions about and always looking at. And so when I started making abstract paintings, I was fascinated by the fact that you can kind of create a visual language that's coded, where it kind of puts everybody on the outside of interpretive meaning. And that fascinated me. One, because I was like, ooh, make up an invented language. That sounds really great. But secondly, thinking about how that could actually function and how I could think about it like further abstracting language, not only in the pictorial sense, but thinking about how it could even function within representational means. So from there, I decided to, I had worked and made some abstract paintings exploring certain ideas, and I think that I really decided to kind of take on this painting as a language and thinking about inventing a whole vocabulary. So I kind of set up some guidelines for myself in the beginning, and I started working on paper that was all the same size. It was 22 by 30 inches. I would gesso it all black, and I would start there, and I thought this is a good way to kind of investigate and see what are the boundaries, what is this language comprised of, what is it that's going to keep resurfacing, returning, what am I going to see here. So in doing that, that lasted for I started there, and this was in 2014 perhaps, but I did that for almost a couple years, just working on paper and really kind of exploring all these different ways of making the image. For a long time, the black ground stayed as a background, but at other times it returned over the surface. And then, things were happening with color that were really interesting. So along this exploration, I'm thinking about color, and I'm learning about color, I feel, in a different way because the ground is shifted. And I thought about, all the color theory that Joseph Albers asserted, and I thought about that. I thought about the books that I learned color theory in. I thought about when I would see images on a screen with this white background, and I just thought there's something about the context shifting to a black ground that seemed to not be included in the conversation. For me, it was the pages of books are white. They are not black. So even when I'm looking at these cubes of color of red and green next to each other, there was still this ground, this context that was still somehow playing a role in my understanding of that, whether I was able to acknowledge it at that time or not. So that's just to say that I became interested in thinking about how do these colors react against a black ground, and I just set up the situation for myself to study for a while. So I started making many of these. So after and during that time, I started thinking, I'm going to make a thing to make other things from. And I thought this collection is going to, once I compiled, I don't know, X number, I decided I'm going to use these studies, that's how I think of them, I'm going to use these studies to create other works from. And so tonight's lecture, I wanted to share with you three kind of, projects, or three kind of ways in which I have used this collection of paintings to make other work from, that have led me in other directions. And for me, that was kind of exciting because I wanted to work beyond just the two-dimensional image. I wanted to work beyond that, but I didn't know that actually. I didn't know what kind of work I'd be making. I just knew that once I had a collection of these, I could kind of lay them out and start thinking about other works that could be produced from them. So this collection became and still is quite important in my practice, and I'm always revisiting it and I'm always expanding it. So I don't know. Maybe there are about 200 or so that I have right now, but it keeps building and it keeps developing as well. So like within that, and in terms of practice, practice has expanded the vocabulary, and practice has made me be a quicker decision maker. The act of continuing revisiting this kind of exercise or study has been so informative to the practice. And I mean, I'm talking not only in like the formal approach, that it also kind of creates a discursive space as well for me in my practice that I think is really important because it raises a lot of questions for me. The newer ones and the older ones, like thinking about getting from one form to another has been really interesting. So this is an image I'm showing you just to show you the scale. One of the first maneuvers that I did with this collection was I decided to kind of shift in scale, and I decided to work quite largely. So I'm going from like very small paper, well, not terribly small, but like what you've seen in the gallery, those are 22 by 30, to like, 9 feet tall paintings by 6 feet wide. And so making that move to do that was a really big leap for me. I became quite comfortable working small, but I knew that I was, it's a point of investigation. I was curious, like, what happens when I do this? And I think that for many artists, it's a kind of research because it's about learning. It's about asking a question of what's at stake for me to make a move like this. And you don't know. It can't just stay in the question. You have to work through by, doing the thing. So it was kind of interesting. I would lay out the smaller ones on the floor and then kind of create the compositions from them. There were other times when I was using a lot of cut paper forms, which is something I'm kind of visiting with students right now in the workshops, is shape invention from cutting out paper. And so you'll notice that in my paintings that a lot of times these forms look very flat, like cut paper. These are all acrylic on canvas, and they are not screen printed. They're not. I don't actually make prints, as I do on the side, but like a lot of people mistake these for prints, and they are not. It's not printmaking. It's very flat painting. And so these provided me an interesting opportunity to think about what happens, when you make this leap. And one of the interesting surprises for me was that when I shifted in scale, the color black went from being addressed as a color and as a ground to thinking of it more as a space. And that happened specifically because of scale. And that was really interesting to me because all of a sudden, I'm starting to recognize my own body in front of these things. I'm starting to recognize the wall in a different way. Architecture becomes very important. So it kind of, making this seemingly simple kind of move, I'm just going to work on a different scale, opened up a lot of different questions for me. And it's also, expanding this kind of the vocabulary. So thinking in terms of thinking that this is a kind of language and how language, I'm thinking in very basic terms, how the English language, functions for me and how it operates. I speak it, I write it down, it exists in the world around me. But now I'm starting to think of like this kind of language and how does it operate and how can it do things differently? And these are very abstract ideas, I realize, and I'm also fascinated by that because it starts to go into a kind of zone of science fiction in some ways for me, thinking about the metaphoric happening and what does it mean to enter another kind of space, what does it mean to engage another kind of dimension and think of these things as kind of entryways in a way that are leading to another kind of reality. And so that led me to go back to this collection and think about another move that could be made that could further extend the language. And every time I kind of shift, whether it's from paper to canvas or I end up going from paper to a wooden object, which you'll see the light purple, the small figures, those are wooden and they're coming out from the wall. When I do that, I start to think about I think of it as an act of translation. So there's a translation that happens. Translation happens a lot with spoken languages, just for the sake of understanding. And I was thinking about here, the act of translation is kind of to expand meaning. And so moving from 2 dimensions into 3 dimensions, and the way to kind of start to move out into the space, what does it mean to do that? And what happens when I do that? And so, in this piece here specifically there's that larger shape that is black is painted on the wall, and then you've got a painting in the center that's actually on canvas that's against the wall, and then you have these kind of small like protrusions of purple that are starting to break out from the wall. And so what does it mean to have a language start to make its way into your space? And I don't know, this was one of the ways in which I started to explore how to think about language in a way that it doesn't operate in my own spoken tongue, or how it only might exist metaphorically in my tongue, like what languages can do. You can build a city with your words, it's metaphoric. Words actually can't build. You need people and physical bodies to do that. But I'm starting to think with these, I'm even thinking about, in terms of like language, I'm thinking of sometimes, I'm thinking about, is there a relationship to the English language, this language that I'm used to? So some of these gestures feel like apostrophes at times, or even quotation. And for me, even this one felt like a subtitle, like how forms can be stand-ins, or at least reference, and reference those kind of things happening in our language that can happen in these paintings that I'm making. So this one is here in the gallery as well. And, I didn't set off to think of them that way, and I wasn't thinking of as language, but then once you do a thing, you start to see the other relationship it has to like other ways in which you work. And so that felt very familiar, a familiar thing to equate them with language and quotation and subtitles and closed caption, those kinds of things. One of the things that I had asked St. Kate's to do is to build these walls out. Actually, Kim personally to build them out. And I was really curious to see what would happen when this painting kind of had its own space. They're very large and flat against the wall, so I had already seen them, flat and in a room with each other. But I thought, there's something more. There's another way that these need to exist. And I feel that I have ideas already for 5 years from now. But for now, it's like one step at a time. I'm like, the walls coming out was a kind of a really great break in the architecture, and also a way to kind of break up the space in the other room. It's a very rectangular room, and I thought something needs to happen in there. And so not only is it that the walls are coming out, kind of framing it, they kind of make an entryway for it. And so I felt that those gray pieces on the side kind of felt like boundary markers, and that's how I saw them, as kind of they're denoting a break in space. And they're denoting that you're about to enter another kind of space that is happening. And so the sculptures, not only here, but then that led to other ideas as well, thinking of how these forms can also operate beyond thinking of them as maybe a quotation or an accent, thinking like how in their own selves they can be something and act as something in relationship to the painting. So going again back to the collection and thinking about the works on paper, once in a while I do work in series, and what has been helpful about that is that not only am I kind of distilling a palette and distilling certain forms, it starts to show me simple relationships between 2 or 3 works on paper at a time. And so another kind of work that has happened is performance. And I started looking at the pictures I was making as kind of a score for performance. At the Union, maybe I'll just leave it here. So, or maybe I can go back. So I'm going to put these here. At the Union for Contemporary Art in Omaha, I had the opportunity to work with a movement-based dance group. And we sat down for many conversations about the work. I had never worked with a choreographer before, but I was interested in the opportunity, thinking about what that could mean to kind of expand into dance. And so as a prompt, I gave her these 3 images. And so these 3 images, they weren't just supposed to be interpreted, so to speak, like in an emotive, expressive way. And they also weren't necessarily meant or intended to be performed just solely based on like trying to imitate through imitation. We had talks about what is happening in the image and what these things could possibly mean and their relationship to each other. And so from, numerous conversations, the choreographer ended up creating a piece, and these were kind of the backbone of the piece, and then she built around it. And that was a really unique experience for me because it helped me understand my own relationship to some of the kinds of works on paper that I make that are referencing postures or gestures or architecture or form, that the body can take those on as well. I reference here dance notation because dance notation has been around since the early 1800s. And dance notation, it's a symbolic representation of dance and movement for the body. And so typically dance notation is, it was used, I think, primarily for the recording and preservation of dance as opposed to like precursor to creating a dance. Both can happen, but I think today it's more common, I believe, for preservation. I don't know a lot, but it's been fascinating to kind of learn about dance notation because how I think about what I'm doing is kind of thinking about a recording of gesture as opposed to the body and the recording of potential movement in a very abstract manner. So I think, and it takes a very unique individual or choreographer that was willing to take that on, I suppose, something that could be so wide open. So this dance performance that happened was really interesting, and the group was really excited about the opportunity, and I think it was a really interesting first run. The gallery ended up painting the walls black to kind of make and create a more immersive experience so that it felt like a real context for this to happen in, as opposed to responding to the work. I felt like it made it more cohesive in many ways. And like I said, this was the first time that I had thought and considered performance, but how I think about it is that it's an expansion of this two-dimensional, it's expansive of this language, and so that what can we now learn and what can I learn now about this kind of language? And also, like, I feel that the exhibition here at St. Kate's is really about leading to, it kind of points me in the direction of thinking about where these things come from. So in that show, you'll notice there are 4 works on paper, and I call them indiscernible objects, but I'm starting to like kind of create this, I don't know, I'm thinking of it like a world that is, things are getting pulled into this world, and they're getting pulled into the gallery that kind of relate to this alternate place, and what can we learn about that? This place where this language functions in and comes from in a way. So I guess it's, in some way, it feels like I'm discovering along the way about this, even though I'm the one creating it. And it's been really interesting. So I'll mute this. And then objects. So with this prior show that I had at a space here in Minneapolis called Company Projects, I decided to create some objects that would be on the wall. And I really started to think about those objects as like how do they make sense in the room. And so I'll come back to that. In this space, I think maybe this is a better one. In this space, the gray, I'm talking about the gray object on the far right hand side, and I'm also talking about this small one here. I started thinking about these objects, though they are based on different forms that appear in the paintings, but how do they have a life of their own and not just remained like an accent or a formal translation from 2D to 3D. But I started thinking of them, when I placed them around the gallery, I started thinking them as boundary markers like I'd called the other ones, but this was the first time I had done that. And I thought like they were all over, and I started thinking about like they start to denote space and the breakup of space. And because they were at different angles and they were at different locations around the room, there were multiple dimensions in which you were crossing over into anytime you walked around that space. What became significant about this work is that I decided to title those in a very specific kind of way. I decided to title them, and I'm talking about this one on the right here, the left, with gestures that I had seen in films. And I felt like I did it so intuitively, I didn't even think about it long enough to really realize what that might have implied. And so at the beginning, when I started getting ready for the exhibition, I titled them, and I remember thinking like, oh, I'd like to do a performance at some point, but I didn't know what that looked like. And so some of the titles, which I would like to read just so you have a better idea. That I wrote down that I cannot find because I can't read my own handwriting. But a long silence held, looking over one's shoulder. So they aren't necessarily movements that are related to dance, but they were related more to film. Filmic, kind of, in my mind, the filmic tropes that you see over and over again in film. Riding a train, staring out of a window, like that. So they became, those ended up becoming kind of, again, the score for the performance that happened. When I met with two young women here in the Twin Cities that were dancers, I gave them those 4 prompts from which they built the entire dance around. And it was quite fascinating because I felt like there still needed to be a kind of narrative present for them to start from. I think they needed something to ground the whole thing in. And it was really about, that became about communicating a language between 2 people where they didn't know the language when they first met, and by the end they understood each other. But it was all through these, there were no speaking, of course, it was just through gestures of the body. And again, it was kind of interesting for me. Like I realized that more than just kind of moving through different mediums, I think that active translation continues to kind of expand what and where and how this language exists. And I feel like there's still probably a lot of territory for that, but it always kind of brings me back to the importance of continuing that practice of the collection and going back to those early works on paper and kind of revisiting them and continuing to ask certain kinds of questions that keep the work progressing and keep moving, so that there's always something for me to discover in that. And I'll end with this image that's taken from my studio floor. A lot of times I make work and then I lay it out on my studio floor and I just look at it. But I think like these larger, architectural forms that kind of come in this very small manner, I think there's still a lot of places that I would like to investigate still. But this is kind of just to give you an overview of where I'm at now from 2014 till now. So anyway, that's it. That's the lecture. So I hope you guys have a few questions or something for me, but if not. Yeah.
So how do you work on the paper? Do you hang it up, or is it on the floor? Because they're obviously very big.
The paper I work flat in front of me. I do. I don't hang them up. They're on a desk. Flat. That's how I like to work. Yeah.
How do you get those clean lines? Do you do paper and then remove it, or what? Because they're very hard to get clean lines like that.
It's magic. There's this spell I have. No, it's, I'm using painter's tape a lot of time. So it's very clean. Yeah, this gentleman.
Could you talk about your text-based series in connection to the abstract black painting?
Are you talking about the ones that are scenes?
Yes.
Like scene 41, like just text?
No, not the ones that are just text. The ones that are abstract mixed with text.
Oh, okay, those. And you saw those?
On your website, actually.
Oh, okay. Oh, you saw those too. So those, I feel like those were early maneuvers, early moments where I was thinking about the film screen, and thinking about the screen as this kind of place where desire is projected, the emotive is projected on that screen. I mean, it goes back to my interest in film, but I thought a lot about that screen. And I thought about the time one sits in front of a screen while there's a moving image. And then I thought about how one sits in front of an abstract or even just a painting and sits, and it's a contemplative space, but it's a space as well for projection of those things. So I had this impulse to kind of see what would happen. Like a lot of times, I think that painting, most people believe like painting is enough. It doesn't need words with it. You don't need anything extra. But I think that the impulse I had to put text under it wasn't to describe the image. It was to kind of create this question, maybe, between how to expand the meaning of something. So I also thought of, like, there's subtitles I have, and I also use closed caption. And when I'm using the closed caption, a lot of times closed caption is for deaf, and so the deaf need the description of what is happening audibly. But a lot of times what I would do is I would describe something for the scene, and it would be redundancy almost. But it's an abstract image, so it's not redundant. So it kind of created, I don't know, for me it felt like it was causing questions between what we expect from abstraction and thinking about using text in some way, not to describe, but maybe to disrupt that moment of projection. I think it stops you from just projecting your own emotion into deconstructing it in some way. Yeah.
So when you find yourself making a mistake on one of your final works, do you keep the mistake, or is it like a happy mistake where you let it stay on the painting? And do you find that changes?
There are no, I don't think about it that way. Actually, though, it's painting. So I'm like, if there's a mistake, you just paint it out. You just erase it by changing it. But I will say that there are moments when I make a move and I'm like, ooh, that was the wrong thing. And so I just have to work from there. But I think one of the things as a painter I've learned is that sometimes those mistakes make you give up. Well, this is at least what I tell myself. Like, okay, this is an opportunity. Just give up good for great. Like, you can stay safe and make a perfectly decent thing, or you could kind of take a risk and mess it up. And then you turn another direction, and then it's a whole different painting. And then you're like, wow, that was really worth the risk, because now I think it's better than it was before. Chris, real quick.
Yeah, you have a very energetic use of color. So how do you feel that works in the construction of your pieces?
You know, I was thinking, I don't know if I'm going to answer your question right, but I was thinking about color today. And I was thinking, like, like somebody always asks, where does your influence of color come from? You know, we live in this world where actually we're inundated with images. And design and fashion, and like, it could come from anywhere. But I think what you'll notice in a lot of my paintings is I always go back to these like dusty pastels and these very, they're pastel. Like a lot of pastels, even that green is like a dusty green. And I think growing up in the Midwest, when I really had a wow moment with color was when I lived in Eastern Europe. And Eastern Europe was the first context where I just was I never paid attention to architecture before. And I thought, like, architecture in my small hometown, it was like the bank was like brick brown, and like the buildings were older. They were probably made in the 60s. There was nothing about the architecture that really caught me, even in form. And so I think a lot of the colors are just embedded in me from that moment of being in an environment where all I did was take in this certain, very specific, strange palette. And also in Romania, a weird thing that happens is that because the country didn't have access to a lot of paint and choices and color, especially under communism, but I was there post-communism, it was still a very slow trickle in of color. So like, if somebody got a can of paint that was bright orange, I'm talking shocking orange, they would paint the whole building orange. And because it was like, well, why not? I get the opportunity to finally do this thing. So like, there were some real intense kind of colors happening in large buildings that were shocking, and I just think that I'm still so influenced by that because I always return to that palette, and it's the only place I can kind of locate it back to because I don't see it necessarily in my fashion, or I don't see it in my house I grew up in or anything. It's kind of there. So, Clarence.
Yeah, there's a reference to a lot of physicality. Well, first of all, I want to ask, can we expect to see more performative works in the future from you?
Not necessarily. I don't know. I mean, there's a few things I would like to do, but I can't. Maybe. I mean, it was like I explored, and I'm like, maybe it makes sense to do something else. But
Let me go back to the physicality and the way the body is sort of inferred in your work, and there's a certain athletic aspect that I see in the work that has a thread to you that you probably haven't talked about.
could you expound on that? I don't know what you mean by there. I don't know if I see like.
What did you do before you got into art?
I was just a kid in the Midwest. No, I mean, I guess what Clarence is referring to is that I was a runner in college and I ran track and field. And I don't know if you're saying like visually you see it, but I think
it's an indirect reference.
I don't know. There is a kind of way in which I have translated the energy of being an athlete into the studio. And I think that part of the prolific nature of producing a lot of works comes from like, what am I going to do with all this energy now? Because it's there, and I think there is something very much that's about athleticism and producing, but it's very helpful because I think after you make X number of works, you're able to like see like, oh, actually I've gotten better at this, or I can make quicker decisions now. And it didn't always work in my practice to work like that, but now it does, and it's really helpful because I need a lot of energy. I just, I'm glad it's there. So yeah, that's how it works. I'll ask you again.
Could you talk about the Wilma Rudolph? Now that you brought it up, could you talk about the Wilma Rudolph?
Oh my gosh, I don't even have references of these. Oh my gosh, that work is it's not that different, but it's very specific work. Is there a specific question you have about it?
Yeah, you brought up the you just brought up the runner.
It's true.
You talked about the Romanian.
So this gentleman is referencing this body of work I did on the 1960s track and field Olympian Wilma Rudolph. And so in a nutshell, I'm going to make this kind of quick. I wanted to explore the act and the feat of winning that race in the 1960s was really fascinating to me because it was in the political turmoil in the United States was so thick. And then Wilma Rudolph, who is kind of doing what she's good at, wins this race, and it does things. It has effect in the country politically. So it like exposed the racism of her own town that was not willing to even throw her a parade. But then they thought, oh, the whole world's eyes are on us. We better throw this woman a parade, or they're going to think we're not good people. And so I just thought it was fascinating that she did one thing over here, and it had this great effect over here, and that kind of crossed time and dimension. And so the work explored traversing of dimensions through the icons of saints and the projection of thinking about time travel and that act all at once. So, but we can talk later if you're interested in more. So, yeah, Margie.
One of the things I want to say is I really like the way that your shapes are very hard-edged and pointed, and they're sharp, and you feel like you're cutting. Yet, when you look at the work, it's like about relationship, and it makes me smile. So I think that that's a pretty interesting, juxtaposition or intersection. But the other thing is, have you ever thought about the marks that go on people's bodies as tattoos?
In what context?
Your performance. So they're taking off the wall, and then people are wearing them.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, you're saying, have I thought about the performers wearing shapes, right?
As some
Yeah.
sort of tattoo.
Yeah, I was thinking, I thought you were talking about, have I thought about people that have tattoos that are cutting into their skin?
No, no.
Well, one of the things that I'm working in the workshop is that one of the prompts I gave students was to kind of invent shapes that could either be a prop standing up, that could be a three-dimensional object, or it could be wearable. And so, like, the wearing of shapes and wearing them on the body, not as a tattoo, but as like cardboard cutouts and forms, like that moving, is something that I was really interested in kind of investigating on this residency. So, yeah. Yeah, Isa.
I was thinking about the construction of a black space,
Mm.
which is like encountering spaces without light is something that I don't encounter very often
Mhm.
because just by the nature of living in an urban environment, there's so much, even just slight ambient light leaking into dark spaces
Mhm.
and interiors. And so I was thinking about how your spaces, your shapes of color are functioning in a kind of blackened space, and it seems to me that there's an implication of suspension, almost as if you're in like an underwater space.
Hmm.
And I don't know if this is a clear connection, but I was wondering if you could speak to that implied verticality and the tendency to orient your works in portrait
Yeah,
orientation.
that's very intentional. I don't work in landscape. You'll notice everything was up and down. And I think I've thought about this a lot. I think for me it goes back to writing, and it goes back to the orientation of like usual paper and orientation of writing something out. And a lot of things that we do that we think are intuitive are actually things that we've done over and over and over, and then it's like then they're intuitive. And I think that's what it does. Like writing was a large part of my life for a long time, and I think that when thinking about language, that just seemed like a natural place to go. And in terms of thinking about these forms, like I started off with the title "A Form Walks Toward You in the Dark." I wanted to kind of reference things that go from being indiscernible to being discernible, legible, from illegible to legible. And I think that these forms, like you actually can't see things in the dark. When it's dark, you can't see anything unless it's lit, maybe lit from the inside. But these forms are all very visible. So it's just a different, it's a different context that's been created in which that happens. Nick.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's really, really interesting to hear you speak yourself, because you've spoken so many times on panels and things, to actually hear your story. I want to ask you about your language that you've developed. So you've got these shapes you've been working with. You're thinking of it as language. You're I guess, creating your own emotional attachments to things, your own perhaps mental attachments to them. Is it to the point where you now construct a kind of a narrative with them? Is it actually like akin to a language, like speaking, constructing sentences, or is it really more symbolic to you? And sort of how does the whole, I overheard you talking the other room, it sounded really interesting conversation about the conceptual and how there has to be a conceptual base for the work. So could you kind of mix that in?
Well, I think the way I've thought about it is that I've kind of set up the stage for myself to work from. So I think it started with the written language form, and then it started to come out in dimension, and the language started to expand, and then it took up the wall space, and then now the architecture is getting involved, and then people now are getting involved. So I feel like all these key figures are in the room of this language. I don't think there's no narrative, because the narrative is that's just so linear way to think. And so I think it's maybe more complex than that, to where once these things are all in the room, let's see what happens, or what can happen. What's the potential in these things existing in different forms and in different ways? And that's kind of where I'm at with this. So I don't know if I have, it's definitely not at the end. I don't know just yet. But I think maybe to answer Clarence's question, I think performance might have to happen again in different ways. And another thing I'm investigating on this residency is spoken dialogue, but not like in sentences potentially, but speaking and movement together that are performed. in proximity to the work, how that might be. And I won't know until I try it. It might be like terrible. And I'm like, I'm glad I didn't do that in public. So I don't know. So, but I'm still investigating, I'd say. Yes.
Several times you referred to your practice as opposed to your work or art. Could you, since it's a very linguistic kind of presentation, could you tell us more about that?
I really think of making an artwork as like maybe a single act. Go somewhere, go to the studio, make this thing. And I feel like the practice is something I'm always carrying with myself. I go to the bookstore and I'm looking and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. It's somehow it'll relate back to the practice. I watch something on Netflix. I'm always thinking like, oh, that's interesting. I got to think about that. That's part of the practice. So I feel like the practice kind of embodies a way of being, and I'm never really separated from it, at least now. I think there was a time when it was like, I'm going to the studio, and now I've got my practice mode on, and I'm going to make. But now it's bigger than that now. And so that's why I use the word practice, because I feel like I'm always in modes of kinds of practice, whether that's like reading, watching something, engaging in like the discourse around contemporary art, or even just art making, teaching, that kind of thing. I feel like it's always present. It like keeps coming up in my daily life. So
I got to see the dance performance at Company and
Yeah.
enjoyed it. And I'm curious about the nitty-gritty of the choreography process. If it was like you gifted dance artists a seed and then let it flow, or were you...
That's a really good question, because that performance happened in under 2 weeks, long distance. It was really strange, because I think it was very successful, because it somehow embodied the strangeness and the obscurity that really felt like there had been a long process of dialogues happen to make that happen. I found those two young women that were willing to work with me on this project that was very abstract to them, but maybe not to them. It was abstract to me, and I was like thinking maybe this will be strange. But we did video. I did discussions with them 2 weeks before the performance through FaceTime, and then we talked, and then they recorded some things and they sent it to me, and I looked at it, and then we talked again. So I kind of would like go back and forth in conversation with them just through media. And then when I arrived in Minneapolis, it was like, I think there were maybe 1 week, 4 days, something like 4 or 5 days, we were in person. And by then they were almost done. So it was just minor tweaks, but I don't know if I would have the luck to do that again under such. I'm like, no, I don't want to push it. I'm not going to try just 2 weeks again. That just came about circumstantially. But if I had more time, I think it could be really fascinating what else could unfold. But I think for that particular instance, it was really interesting. Okay. So, yeah.
Could you speak about the Carmen line and why?
Yes. And that is really good, because I'm thinking about this essay that Nicole's been working on. She wrote this essay for the show that's really interesting, because I feel that the Carmen line, which is this theoretical kind of border from outer space that kind of breaks Earth's atmosphere to outer space, which I didn't even know the word for it before I started thinking about how do I talk about the crossing over of space from a known into an unknown, except I'm certain it's still unknown before you get there. But I used it metaphorically, kind of to talk about in the work, thinking about geography and place. So I think like the language has been addressing bodily movement, and it's been addressing different things about writing with this language and dimension. And I thought this is an opportunity to kind of talk a little bit, have this show engage a conversation about the where this is coming from. So if language has an origin in a specific place in the world, though nomadic, I understand. I'm thinking like, where does this language come from? I mean, yes, I'm kind of like somehow producing it, but it's also revealing a kind of where by making it, and that fascinated me. So I hope that answers your question. I think it does. Yeah. Right.
And I'm curious what your take is on time.
I think with time, first of all, I think of it, if I want to be, if I don't, I personally don't necessarily think of time in the same way most painters think of time being represented in the surface of a painting. But I do think that that is at least the initial point in which time enters the conversation in the work. Thinking about how time is present in a lot of the in the way that I'm painting a lot of these images. And so the immediacy of a brush mark, that kind of time is implied that way. Then I can pull back and think about time that is present in some of the forms that feel like Isa was saying, suspended or caught. There's a visual or pictorial sense of time. But then time kind of expands into when you bring in people all of a sudden and you've got movement, time is present, of course, through the body moving through space. But there's also maybe what I would say, what I kind of think of the most present facet of time in my work is when they're the large-scale flat paintings, and that there is something about that suspended state where things feel like they have come just to this moment, that time is maybe the most present. At least that's how I relate to it, like that. So it's an illusion. Yeah.
It got me thinking about language in terms of parts of speech, and I'm latching onto a word that you use today in your talk, and also in the title of one of your workshops, and that is maneuver. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about why that appeals to you as a verb and as a noun.
Oh, well, okay, the workshop was kind of a joke in some way, like orchestral maneuvers in the dark, if anyone was like, that was like the reference there. But I thought of a maneuver as not quite like a device, but as a thing you do to get to another place. That's how I'm thinking about these maneuvers. And I think that's for me because language is often used as a tool, and it's used not to stay in itself, but to communicate something else and to get somewhere, to move farther along in this kind of linear way. And I think that in terms of the practice, when I make a maneuver, it means not to stay so static, that it's on its way to becoming something else. And I don't even know where that just came from, but don't Instagram that. No, I'm joking.
Can I ask you one more question?
Sure.
It's a tedious art historical question, but I'm
Uh-oh.
a historian, so I'm interested on you. Artists that you admire, I'm just curious.
Hilma af Klint. Her show right now, where is it, Rob? Do you know? Is it the Guggen? Who? Okay, Guggenheim, yeah. So yeah, I really like her paintings. Those are really amazing. I also, let me think off the top of my head who else. I mean, I love a lot of artists and a lot that don't look anything like my practice. I was thinking of Jenny C. Jones as a painter, but I don't even know if she considers herself a total painter, but she's an amazing artist. Leslie Hewitt, who's a photographer, is really great. I really love Jack Whitten and the book that he just produced, or that just came out, that was produced, Notes from the Woodshed. That's a good one. Charles Gaines, he's an amazing artist. He's going to be speaking in Chicago soon. He's great. He's a heavy one. Yeah, those are cool. This is the longest Q&A I've ever had. Oh my gosh, this is fascinating.
So, I just wanted to say, I thought it was really interesting how you talked about how you learned and grew throughout your different works and things that you learned during the making of them or the different processes. Because I think a lot of times, especially as like a younger artist myself, we get stuck in this point where it's like you can't put anything out there until it's absolutely perfect, and you have to kind of do everything behind the scenes until you show everyone what you've done. So I thought it was just really neat to hear your process behind that and how you're still learning as you're creating art and putting it out into the world. And I just thought that was really funny.
Oh, I'm glad.
And then I just wanted to ask if you had like any, like if you had to give one piece of advice for like young or inspired or aspiring artists,
Mhm.
what would it be?
I started telling my students this year. It's a lifelong, like marathon. Like art making is not like you don't arrive, like you're in it for the long haul. Like that's how you have to look at it, so that you don't like get caught up on this is where I have to get to, because it does this, and it doesn't do that. But also, I will say, this is so cheesy for me to say, and I'm like, this is still being recorded, I understand, but which we can maybe talk about editing later. But I'm 43, and when I did not expect that earlier this year I'd be in my studio, like, oh my gosh, I'm making up this abstract language, and I'm thinking about other realities. I'm thinking, wow, I'm having so much fun, and it feels so new. And I'm like, am I allowed to feel this way right now? I feel like a kid. But I'm like, but I have a lot of responsibilities now. So I think I say that is that, like, your practice, what you do and your making can become so exciting later. I didn't foresee this kind of excitement, to be honest. And I don't know if I've been as excited as I've ever been until now. Like, I've enjoyed it. It's been fun. But all of a sudden, I think things started, making that collection and, like, being able to keep going back to it and make other things from it is great. And I can't equate that to anything outside of that, just being what it is. Like, I think it's just from the making that gets exciting when things start clicking. That's it. So that kind of sounds cheesy. So I'm like, oh my gosh. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.